This past weekend, Orthodox Christians celebrated Easter, which is often on a different Sunday than our Easter. Not surprisingly, the most unforgettable images I saw online came from Ukrainian Orthodox Christians. They flocked to churches and cathedrals on Sunday morning to mark what they call the Great Day, after their centuries-old tradition of midnight Easter services was abandoned over fears of Russian shelling and a nationwide curfew. In Kyiv, the faithful encircled St. Sophia Cathedral, waiting for the priest to bless them with holy water, as well as bless the baskets they had brought with them. And these Easter baskets were filled with ornately painted Easter eggs, Pascha, which is a traditional Easter bread, candles, and other festive foods such as sausage, ham, and cheese. How they managed to assemble these Easter baskets in the midst of a war zone is a testimony to the strength and determination of the Ukrainian people. Nearby, a volunteer was loading collection boxes of Easter food for Ukrainian troops, and he was quoted as saying, "We're trying to keep a festive mood and hope for justice and peace. This holiday Easter gives even more hope. We have to believe in victory, as well as we believe in Jesus Christ." And then gesturing to the rapidly filling containers, he added, "They will be sent to the military units who protect our land. The soldiers should have an opportunity to eat some Pascha and sausage." President Volodymyr Zelensky sent out a video message from inside St. Sophia Cathedral. Here's an excerpt from his message. He said, "The great holiday today gives us great hope and unwavering faith that light will overcome darkness, good will overcome evil, life will overcome death, and therefore Ukraine will surely win. And on Easter, we ask God for great grace to make our great dream come true, that the day when great peace will come to Ukraine, and with it eternal harmony and prosperity. With faith and confidence in this, I congratulate all of you this Easter. Take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, take care of Ukraine. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed." And there is something about the story of the Ukrainian celebration of Easter, and especially those Easter baskets, that really spoke to me this week. And what I hear them telling us is this: when we find ourselves surrounded by death and sadness, it's often the small things which matter the most. And these small things remind us of Christ's presence in our lives, and they fill us with hope. Let me give you another example. Last week, I spent 3 days at Camp Lutheridge at Create in Me. And for those of you who are not familiar with this retreat, it's a place where we explore the connections between creativity and faith. And I led a workshop on building miniatures out of XPS foam and also led the closing worship. It's a retreat I helped to develop about 20 years ago, and I think I've only missed it once since it began. And there is a core group of people who have also attended this retreat every year. So we're a pretty tight group. Thanks to the pandemic, the 2020 and 2021 retreats were canceled. So it has been 3 whole years since we last gathered as a group. Yes, there were lots of Facebook messages along the way and a few Zoom get-togethers during this time, but we all know it's not the same as gathering in person. So during our time together, Jesus showed up everywhere. He appeared in some long overdue hugs and heart-to-heart conversations about how this pandemic has affected each of us. He appeared as we explored various art projects and rekindled the creative spirit that lives in each and every one of us. You too. There was lots of love and laughter, and it felt like hope was reborn and new life was being restored to our withered spirits. Like the Ukrainian Easter baskets, this retreat also reminded me that when we find ourselves surrounded by death and sadness, it's often the small things which matter the most. And these small things bear witness to Christ's presence in our lives, and they fill us with hope. And the interesting thing to me about the post-resurrection stories is that we see this same dynamic happening as the followers of Jesus encounter the risen Christ. In last week's gospel, the disciples were hiding in fear behind locked doors, afraid that the authorities would come after them next. They weren't out in the they weren't out in the streets proclaiming Christ is risen, he is risen indeed, like you think they would in the movies. Instead, they were sheltering in place and social distancing from others. Sound familiar? And the beautiful thing about this story is that Jesus doesn't make a flashy appearance in their midst with heavenly choirs singing and clouds of glory swirling all around him. Instead, he makes it much smaller. He appears out of nowhere, and he quietly comforts the disciples, saying, "Peace be with you." Then, in the Emmaus Road story, two disciples quickly packed their bags and tried to get as far away as they could from the horrors they had witnessed as Jesus was mocked, beaten, and crucified. And suddenly, a stranger appears before them, and he engages them in holy conversation as they walk toward the city of Emmaus. And when they reach this little village, the two disciples invite the guests to stay with them. And while sitting down to supper, the guest takes the bread, he blesses it, and he breaks it, and suddenly they realize it's Jesus who has been traveling with them the whole time. And again, the beautiful thing about this story is that Jesus doesn't make a flashy appearance or give some big scene-stealing Academy Awards speech. Instead, he is found in intimate conversation and in the simple gifts of bread and wine. Finally, in today's gospel lesson, we find the disciples feeling a bit sad and defeated. They return to an activity that was both familiar and comforting, fishing. And this is what we do when we find ourselves surrounded by death and sadness. We try to take comfort in simple things and familiar routines. And while the miraculous haul of fish is quite flashy, it serves a purpose in this story. It reminds the disciples of when it all began. It's a replay of a simple experience they first had with Jesus when he called them to be his disciples. And the beautiful thing about this story happens when Jesus invites them to come ashore and he cooks them breakfast. Breakfast of all things. But let's admit it, who doesn't like breakfast? It's not big and flashy, but it's comfort food for the soul. There are days when I would eat that for lunch or for dinner because it's what my soul needed. And Jesus knows this, so why doesn't it surprise us that this is the gift of grace he chooses to give his stressed out disciples? Then Peter is engaged by Jesus in holy conversation. And it's not a time to list the ways that Peter failed his Lord. Instead, Jesus keeps it quite simple. He just says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" To which Peter responds, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Love is the glue that binds our lives together when we feel like they're falling apart. Love is the healing balm for our wounded hearts. Love is the power that will bring us together after 2 years of isolation and social distancing from others. My dear friends, if you remember anything from my sermon, I hope it is this. When we find ourselves surrounded by death and sadness, it's often the small things which matter the most. And these small things remind us of Christ's presence in our lives, and they fill us with hope. So it is my hope and prayer that the risen Christ will send you lots of small things this week, so that you will be reminded that Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Amen.